welcome to a Minnesota Banking Minute. I'm Renee Lawler with the Minnesota Bankers Association, and today I'm here with Steve Sievert with Pulse, a Discover company. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Renee.
Well, today we're going to talk about debits and why debit matters more now than it ever has before. So we all know debit is a cornerstone of banks' relationships with their account holders. How big of a role does debit play for community banks?
Renee, debit truly is central to the relationship that banks have with their account holders. Debit represents 75% of checking account activity, comprises 25% of non-interest income for the average community bank, and also is the most frequent touch point that account holders have with their bank. And we've been commissioning the Debit Issuer Study for 15 years now. A key metric that we track is the average number of transactions each month. And in this year's study, that number is up to more than 25 debit transactions each month. That is an all-time high in the 15 years that we have been doing this study. So it's hard to overstate the importance of debit to a community bank when it comes to driving bottom line performance and also building brand trust among their account holders.
How has debit been impacted with the pandemic?
Well, at the onset of the pandemic, as you would expect, debit volumes plunged as we all, or at least most of us, were under these stay-at-home orders, and we really focused on ourselves and taking care of our families. But then what we saw toward the latter half of April is a stabilization of that volume, and then even through the early part of April saw spikes in grocery in particular. Then as we've moved through the pandemic, increases in e-commerce transactions started to take hold in April and May in particular. And by way of one data point here on the Pulse network, our e-commerce volume for those 2 months increased 50% compared to the same 2 months last year. So you're seeing consumers continue to accelerate their adoption of e-commerce in the wake of the pandemic.
So debit is a mature product for banks. How have emerging digital transactions and changing consumer behaviors impacted debits?
Well, the emergence of digital commerce, think about transactions such as in-app purchases, using a mobile phone to conduct purchases, and then also this explosion in e-commerce transaction activity, has fundamentally changed how we as consumers shop. But what hasn't changed is that consumer preference for debit. Consumers are just moving the utilization of debit into these new channels. And debit continues to be top of wallet for many consumers, both in that physical wallet, as traditionally has been the case, and now into the digital wallet as well. And what we're finding is card not present transactions, think about those in-app purchases and also e-commerce, growing at 10 times the rate of physical card transactions. And we believe this is a trend that's just going to accelerate as we continue to deal with the pandemic in our daily lives and how the pandemic is impacting our shopping behavior.
Mm-hmm. What about those contactless cards? Is that a focus for debit issuers in 2020?
It is. We think contactless debit is finally ready for prime time. So what we found in the study this year is already a third of financial institutions are issuing contactless debit. Another third plan to do so this year. And there are three trends that are really accelerating this increased appetite for contactless. First, you're seeing the natural expiration of debit cards from this first wave of EMV card issuance that took place about 3 or 4 years ago. That's number one. Number two, you're seeing the price point for contactless debit cards come down, so the technology is much more affordable for community banks. And the third factor here is reducing the friction in the payment experience as there are more merchants accepting contactless payments. And then we also believe that even some of those banks who have been on the sidelines that we heard from in this year's study, as a result of the pandemic, they'll likely be rethinking those strategies as many of us consumers simply make it a personal priority to reduce the contact points and the touch points that we experience in our lives to keep ourselves healthy and safe. That's likely to change some plans and accelerate contactless issuance even more.
Steve, I want to thank you for giving us this insight on your study that you put together. We look forward to diving in and reading more about it. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Renee.